it is likely that the Mahasanghikas, who were of a laxist tendency, discarded the first 9 practices as being negligible and modified the 10th in conformity with their ruling, which forbade an individual monk to handle gold and silver or to keep any in reserve, but authorized gifts of cash to be added to the unassignable assets of the community. In the council, Parziluski and Hoffinger see a strong tension between the Western schools, that is the Sthavir, Mahishasak, Dharmguptak and Sarvastivadin, and the Eastern school, the Mahasanghika. However, Andre Barrow feels that, to quote him, in place of an opposition between the Eastern and the Western communities, we find rather at the origin a conflict between the rigorous tendencies of the missionaries occupied with conquering new territories for Buddhism and the laxist tendencies of the monks leading to an easy life in the great monasteries of the holy cities of Buddhism, where the pilgrims flocked. This geographic opposition has no relation with the doctrinal opposition between the Mahasanghikas, which appears nowhere in our recitation, unquote. Demierville sees in the tradition relative to the Council of Vaishali, above all, a reflection of this conflict between rigorism and laxism, between monasticism and laicism, between sacred and profane, which traverses all the history of Buddhism and which, after having provoked the schism between the Sthaviras and Mahasanghikas, is expressed later by the opposition between Hinayan and Mahayana. None of the Vinayas, however, mentions a schism anywhere, and from the perspective of the Vinaya, the council proceedings satisfied both groups involved, and with the strict monastic discipline reinforced, a schism was avoided. Andre Barrow has said as much as that the primitive version is anterior to the first schism, that which separated the Mahasanghikas from the Sthaviras. According to Nalinaksh Datta, it is quite probable that the schism began with the disciplinary rules and in the course of time incorporated matters of doctrine. There can be no question, according to Dutt, about the fact that the council marked the beginning of division in the Buddhist church and that the disruption hinged on the 10 unvinayak rules. Thus, according to Dutt, this council resulted in the first schism in the Sangha that appears to have been caused by the Sthaviras, the rigorous reformists, who broke away from the majority Mahasanghikas after having failed to modify the Vinaya. Lance Cousins also agrees with Dutt and says that, to quote him, the Mahasanghikas were essentially a conservative party resisting a reformist attempt to tighten discipline. The likelihood is that they were initially a larger body representing the mass of the community, the Mahasangha, unquote. On the whole, modern scholarship is in general agreement that the Mahasanghika Vinaya is the oldest. This also agrees well with the views of the Chinese monk Faxian, who had travelled to India for the purpose of procuring the Mahasanghika Vinaya, which was considered as the original. Herman Oldenburg has misgivings about the authenticity of the council, on the basis that the Vinaya text does not take into consideration the issues deliberated at Vaishali in the absence of all epigraphical or archaeological confirmation. Demyeville is also doubtful about its historicity. However, both Andre Barrow and Hoffinger see the Council of Vaishali as historical. In view of the general agreement among different traditions, the session of the Second Council was historical. As far as the history of the councils is concerned, each of the different recensions of the Vinaya continue to use the tradition of the councils as proof of the authenticity and antiquity of its own canonical writing compiled by each of its own scholars. They take pride in specifying them and oppose, at least implicitly, their canon to those of the other schools. Another concern of the various recensions of the Vinaya is to adapt the tradition of the council to their own rules of discipline. This is why the 10 practices of the Vajjiputtas are interpreted and explained in such a way that it is easy to find an article condemning them in the recensions that were already settled. Thus, a connection between the tradition of the first two councils and the Buddhist discipline was created somewhat artificially, so that the history of the councils appears to be concerned with the Vinaya rather than the Dharma and rules rather than doctrines. The overriding concern is no longer to establish the antiquity of the canonical writings, but to highlight the legitimacy of the transmission of the Dharma. So the Sri Lankan chronicles as well as their commentaries on the one hand and the travelogues of the Chinese visitors on the other hand, both belonging to about the same period, are remarkable for certain common features. Details are missing in the Chinese sources, which pass in silence over the Council of Vaishali or merely mention it incidentally. Another more important point is the extent of the literary activity attributed to the Council of Vaishali. It is no longer just a question, as in the Pali Vinaya, of a recitation of the discipline, but of a complete re-edition of the Dharma, a Dhamma Sangraha in the words of the Mahavansh, a new compilation according to Xuanzang. As it had not been possible to impose the decisions taken at the council on all the members of the community, the latter is thought to have immediately split into various schools. So in this lecture I have basically talked about the background to the convening of this council and how this council was historical, not fiction as some scholars have suggested. Thank you so much.